Hello and welcome back to another episode of Sermon Braindump. My name is Scott Dalen. I am an ELCA pastor in Southwest Iowa, and I present these videos every week for a couple of different reasons. The first one is to offer you, the viewer, who is stumbled across this video for whatever reason, whether you are a regular viewer or if you just happen to find it somehow strange, to gain some different insight into the assigned text for the week. And the second reason I do it is just to kind of move my brain out of the mode of background work and all kinds of funky stuff with the text over the course of the week, and then move into the mode of actually writing and preparing the sermon that I'll preach to my congregation for the weekend. So that's why I do these videos. Yeah, that's why I do these videos. So this particular Sunday, which is May 27th, May 29th, 2016, Memorial Day weekend for us here in the United States. And is also the second Sunday after Pentecost. Our gospel lesson is coming back out of Luke. Now, if you've been tuning in, we have been kind of all over the map for a while now here through the season of Easter and the day of Pentecost, which was 2 weeks ago, and then last week, the first Sunday of Pentecost, which is also Holy Trinity Sunday. We've kind of had some different gospel lessons. We've been in the Gospel of John for a while, which is normal this time of year. But we've also, if you've seen the last couple of weeks of videos, I've kind of done some different things. I preached out of Acts 2 weeks ago for the day of Pentecost, and last week I actually preached out of Paul's letter to the Romans. Now this week we are jumping back into Luke, as I mentioned. Now, at this point of the year, we are kicking off the longest season of the year as we are into the season of Pentecost. And it will last actually all the way through to the end of November, when we start off the season of Advent yet again. And if you're familiar with the church calendar, Advent, which is the 4 Sundays prior to Christmas, actually kicks off the new church year. So it doesn't quite match up with the calendar year. It's off by about a month, give or take a few days. So that's kind of where we're at. We're into the season of Pentecost. The colors, liturgical colors, as they call them, go back to green and stay that way pretty much without interruption, just a couple of exceptions from now until we hit Advent. So they call this ordinary time. I used to know exactly what that means, but I've kind of lost it in the course of things. But we're kind of into the time now where what we do, what our focal point is, the various texts and lessons that are assigned by the lectionary, we kind of move through the history of the church, so we kind of start off with things now that are fairly early on, and then gradually we'll move into some teachings as the season goes on, and as we get close to the end of the season of Pentecost, we'll move into some text with focus that kind of in the end times. And I've talked about this before in different videos. Maybe you've seen that, but that's kind of where we're at now. So things kind of calmed down here in my congregation anyway, with it being Memorial Weekend. Our program year is all done, so we're really getting into the summer mode. In fact, we shift to our summer schedule this particular weekend, and we'll be in there until we hit Labor Day in September. But just kind of a more casual, calm time of year, and that's kind of just the way things sort of go. And as we remember that the early church, and kind of throughout the history of the church, it's been living life, a life of faith in the midst of our day-to-day ongoing life. And so maybe if we want to talk about things being ordinary, maybe that's where it comes from. That might not be the official thing. Like I said, I'm kind of blanking on it, but that's what I'm thinking at the moment. Okay, all that being said, that's a whole bunch of background for where we're at. But as I said a moment ago, we are getting back into Luke. We are still in the year of Luke, or year C in the lectionary, as we wrap up the tail end of the 3-year cycle, which when we get to Advent again in the end of November, then we'll switch back over to the year of Matthew, year A, and the lectionary cycle will kind of start over at that point, but we're coming down to it now. So all that being said, our gospel lesson for this Sunday, the second Sunday after Pentecost, comes from Luke chapter 7, verses 1 through 10. Now, a little bit of background on the text before we jump into that, simply because of the way it starts off. It's a transitional verse that begins it. It says, after Jesus had finished all his sayings, and what that is referring to, he's been teaching, and in Luke, it's called the the Sermon on the Plain, which corresponds with Matthew's account, which is the Sermon on the Mount. A little better known that way. It's not as long here in Luke, though it's still lengthy. Many of the same elements are there, though not quite all of them, but we do have the presence of the Beatitudes and some of the teachings of, well, you've heard this said, but now I tell you. And so this has all been going on. It's been a long, kind of a long haul, but it's still quite early on in Jesus' ministry. We have had the calling of the first disciples. There's been healings going on, and so that's been happening, and that's all important leading into this text. It's some important background stuff that has been going on. One thing that we do hear, we don't hear it in Luke, but we hear it in some of the other Gospels, particularly in Matthew, is that Jesus makes his home in the city of Capernaum. Now, Capernaum is a town right on the border of the Sea of Galilee, kind of on the northern section of the Sea of Galilee. So it's in the northern part of Israel or Judea or whatever we want to call it, and the vicinity or the region where Jesus is active. Makes his home there, but granted, he's moving around all the time. That's kind of his thing, but that seems to be his home base. A little other side notes, we know that some of the disciples that are from there, that is the home of Peter and his brother Andrew. Very likely James and John are from there as well. It seems that Matthew might also be from there. And then, of course, we don't necessarily know about the other ones, but at least some of the disciples are from that region or that area. Capernaum itself was an important town, being right there on the seashore, and there was also at the crossroads of some different travel routes, so it was important from that perspective, but not huge, large town-wise for Jesus' time, but some of the different information that I found on it shows that Capernaum, at its height, probably had about 1,500 people living there, so not a real big town. I grew up in a town outside of town, went to school in a town of about 800 people, where pretty much everybody knew everybody. You had a pretty good idea who people were. So if something big happened, you pretty much knew about it. And that's kind of all fits into some of the action of what's going on today. Pardon my Kleenexing there. And yet this town wouldn't have been a whole lot larger than that, about double the size of the small town that I grew up in, but still a very personable hamlet. Hamlet? Okay, weird. Let's jump in now that I've been jabbering for quite a while. Okay, so Luke 7, verses 1 through 10. After Jesus had finished all his sayings in the hearing of the people, he entered Capernaum. A centurion there had a slave who he valued highly, who was ill and close to death. Okay, so now that's our setting. A little note on a centurion. What that is, a centurion is an officer in the military, the Roman military. So, and centurion sounds like century, which is 100. So a centurion was basically an officer over 100 men. So he's not super high up in the whole military scheme of things, but he's got some authority. He's got some power. And he's got men that operate under him while he also has people that he answers to. So, but we hear that the centurion there, now we don't know, does the centurion live there in Capernaum? It sort of seems like it, but we don't exactly know. He could be from a different town, but likely his house, his home is there, and perhaps there's a garrison there. Because of the importance of the travel routes, and that's why he's there. Anyway. So he has a slave who he valued highly, who was ill and close to death. When he heard about Jesus, he sent some Jewish elders to him, asking him to come and heal his slave. When they came to Jesus, they appealed to him earnestly, saying, "He is worthy of having you do this for him, for he loves our people. It is he who built our synagogue for us." And Jesus went with them. But when he was not far from the house, the centurion sent friends to say to him, Lord, do not trouble yourself, for I am not worthy to have you come under my roof. Therefore I do not presume to come to you, but only speak the word and let my servant be healed. For I also am a man set under authority, with soldiers under me, and I say to one, Go, and he goes, and to another, Come, and he comes, and to my slave, Do this, and the slave does it. When Jesus heard this, he was amazed at him, and turning to the crowd that followed him, he said, I tell you, not even in Israel have I found such faith. When those who had been sent returned to the house, they found the slave in good health. Okay, so that's the gospel lesson in its entirety. So we've got the centurion, who is a Roman, therefore most likely a Gentile. I mean, we're about 99% sure he was a Gentile. It's possible, based on what we hear in this passage, that he was a Gentile convert to Judaism. It's possible. It's unlikely, but it's possible. But some different things are at play here that are slightly different than what we hear in some of the other Gospels. Now, Matthew has the same story, and it's pretty similar. About the only difference is, instead of working through intermediaries, the centurion actually comes and addresses Jesus directly. Different here in that he sends people to talk to Jesus instead of meeting with him himself. So that's different. We have a similar type of story in Mark's account, though the setting is different. It's in that case, it's the Syrophoenician woman who asks Jesus to come and heal her daughter, and there's an exchange there, and then he says, "Go, your daughter is healed." So the similarity there, another Gentile, and also he heals from afar. He simply speaks the word, and it is done, even though he's not in the presence of the person. John also has a similar account. It also happens in Capernaum. There it's just said that an official whose son was sick came and asked Jesus, and they go back and forth, and likewise Jesus heals from a distance. So that aspect within the four Gospels, we see it. Matthew and Luke here have the really similar aspects of that story. The other ones could be different instances that happened. And that's certainly possible. But so we have these two. But the major difference is in Matthew, the man comes to Jesus directly, and here in Luke, he doesn't. And that's important as we think about the fact that Jesus never actually meets this guy, at least not in the story. It's possible, again, if that they may have encountered each other before. Again, Capernaum, not a big town. So it's possible they've encountered, maybe even interacted before. Maybe not, but in this instance, Jesus is not present with the centurion, the person making the request, nor is he, I said nor, who talks like that? Neither, he's also not with the slave who's actually the recipient of the miracle, of the healing. So Jesus does not encounter either one of them in this particular instance. And so that's interesting that he's basically, Jesus is encountering the faith of a person who's not even there, and which is interesting. Now, okay, so that being said, there's two groups that are sent to Jesus by the centurion. First is he sends the Jewish elders from town to go and get Jesus. There's some speculation as to why that is. As him likely being a Gentile, it's possible that Jesus, being this traveling rabbi, would not listen if he just got word that hey, this guy wants you to come. So the centurion sends the Jewish leaders thinking, well, Jesus will listen to them because they are the elders of his religion. They're important. They have some status. He'll listen to them. And what's interesting is that they vouch for him. They vouch for the centurion. They say he's a friend of our nation. He loves our nation. He built the synagogue for us. So we tend to think of the centurion as a good dude. But the important thing to note is we don't know. He might be a good guy, but he also might not be. He's a slave owner. And we hear that in here, that he owns a slave. And when it says that the slave is highly valued to him, that could either mean that he cares about this slave, or it could also mean that this is a slave who is of great monetary value and he doesn't want to lose him. And if that's the case, is this guy just being greedy and wanting his slave to be saved from the sickness? Likewise with the whole building of the synagogue thing. He might do it because he has come to believe in this God that the Jewish people believe in, or he might have done it out of some political savvy to like, hey, I'm going to curry favor with the people that I'm in charge of. So I'm going to build them this synagogue so they stay happy. And so his motivation for all this stuff, we don't really know. We don't necessarily have that. So we don't want to jump to conclusions about this guy. Is he a good dude? Is he not a good dude? We don't know. We simply know his position. We know his situation. We don't know any of the other details that surround it. But what's interesting is, so the Jewish guys who come to Jesus say he's worthy of having you do this. And for what? And Jesus is like, okay, well, let's go. So they're going. And as they're getting close to the house, the Gentile or the centurion again sends another group, this time a group of his friends, whoever they are, to Jesus and says, don't trouble yourself. I'm not worthy to have you come in my house. But rather simply speak the words and let it be done. And then there's the section about the authority that he is in the midst of. You know, he finds himself in a hierarchy. He understands authority, for he is under authority from officers who are above him, and yet he's also exerts the authority over his soldiers and his slaves below him. He says, come and go, and they do it. So he speaks the word and it happens. That's how this notion of authority works. So he's familiar with that, but he says, I'm not worthy to have you come under my roof. And that can be for a couple of different reasons. One, he might recognize the custom of the Jewish people that they don't enter into a Gentile house because it makes them ceremoniously unclean. And so maybe he's wanting to save Jesus from that, respecting the culture, or at least tolerating the culture of this town where he is stationed. That's one possibility. The other possibility is that he recognizes something about Jesus that is more than what he is. Very likely, as I said before, he's probably heard of the miracles. Word has traveled, especially in a small town of less than 2,000 people. Word's going to spread. They didn't have TV to watch. They didn't have internet to take up their time, video games to play. So they sat around and talked. And if this random dude who lives here has performed miracles, miraculous healings, which we hear quite a few of beforehand, word's going to spread. People are going to hear about it. So again, we don't know exactly what the thought process is of the centurion. Is he simply honoring the customs of the Jewish people, or does he recognize the divinity of Jesus? We don't know. But what does seem to be going on here is the centurion understands something about authority. And that's a theme that's very present throughout Luke's writings. And not just Luke's writings, it's present throughout all the Gospels, but within Luke, it's pretty prominent. We hear the word authority, which exousia is the Greek word for it. It pops up a lot, and oftentimes, most of the time, it's presented as describing Jesus being one who teaches with authority, even though with his background he shouldn't have it. And also having authority over spirits and diseases, which is what's on display here in this story. Whatever is going on, whatever it is, it seems, at least to me, that the centurion is recognizing the presence of the one who can speak things into reality, who can speak things how do I want to say this? Can speak something into being. Whether he recognizes that to be the God of creation who spoke reality into reality, let there be light, and there was. God make up his mind that he wanted light, and there it was. That he can say, let this be done, and it will be. And that's an authority that is not human. The centurion is within an authority structure, and he recognizes, he understands it. It seems that he understands Jesus to be possessing of a different type of authority, a divine authority. Human authority is granted. It's granted by those above, and it's also, to a certain extent, granted by those who fall underneath it. I recognize your authority. I give you authority over me, and I will honor it. Just as I hand authority down the ladder to you to exert over those below you. So it's that hierarchy, that structure, and it's given. Whereas divine authority is not given. It simply is. And that's kind of the direction that I want to go with this sermon, is the notion of human authority versus divine authority. And if Jesus is in possession of divine authority, which we know that he is, and we see it in this story, he holds that divine authority. He says it's done, and it is, from a distance. What does that say about Jesus? And likewise, what does that say about us and what Jesus says about us? He says that we are loved. He says that we are claimed. He says that our sins are forgiven. He says it is finished. And if he says it, well, then by golly, it is. And that's kind of where I'm going to go with this sermon as I'm working on it. Now, I see I've crossed the 20-minute mark. This one's gotten lengthy and long. If you've stuck with me this whole time, good job. Kudos to you. So I'm going to wrap it up. If you have thoughts, questions, comments based on this of your own, please share those down in the comment section, and we will continue the conversation that way. Otherwise, I hope you have a blessed week, and we'll catch you next time.